Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome back to another episode of ReConnect with Plant Wisdom. It's me, Tigre Gardenia. Ah, I have so much to tell you about today. I have so much to tell you. Okay, so last week I offered my Befriend Your Limiting Beliefs so you can do things you once thought impossible. It's an interactive webinar that I created that is, well, it's amazing. In this webinar, I address all the feelings of overwhelm that you might have by the constant stream of ideas and the idea that you might only start certain projects and let them. In other words, I talked about limiting beliefs. Okay. That was really the crux of it. What is a limiting belief? Why is it actually something different than the way that you've been taught? Why are we not supposed to be getting rid of our limiting beliefs, but instead we're supposed to be working with our limiting beliefs? There is just so much there. And I went into in great detail what it means to actually be a multipotentialite. Now, you've heard me talk about this term before. If you're new here, then here's what it is. A multipotentialite is a multi-passionate person. So it's a person that has so many different exceptional talents or skills or creative pursuits, lots and lots of ideas, any more of which you could actually focus on completely, probably for one lifetime. But we are overwhelmed with them and we have tons of them. You've probably held down multiple types of jobs, even multiple careers. You have lots of different activities that you carry out. And it's a concept that for many people can be kind of scary because we are taught that you're supposed to just have one, not all the many different ones that we actually have. So this webinar is really focused, which is a funny term to use since I don't actually kind of believe in focus or discipline, on helping the multipotentialite kind of accept their multipotentialite nature and creating a different relationship with what we have thought are limiting beliefs. And so I also introduced a concept that is truly central to really understanding how to weave together all of these talents. Why is it that some of us have so many different passions and we feel restless when we're stuck in one for too long? And the answer is that it's really not about what you do, but about how you do it. So, with that, let's get into this episode, which is episode 81, Your Deep Pattern, Weaving Your Passions Together. Welcome to Reconnect with Plant Wisdom. I'm your host, Tigria Gardenia, nature-inspired mentor, certified life coach, and the founder of the Naturally Conscious community. For over a decade, I've been known as a world ambassador for plant advocacy, working closely with plants to share their practical wisdom to help you consciously embody the elements of life that nourish your evolution. In this podcast, I delve into ancient and modern knowledge from biology to spirituality about the wondrous ways of plants. Together, we'll explore how ecosystem thinking helps you overcome limiting beliefs, understand the true nature of relationships, and live an authentic, impactful life. Okay, so this is going to be another one of those episodes where I'm going to bring together some scientific knowledge mixed with some spiritual physics and probably a hint of psychology and social innovation, or really nature-inspired social innovation. So ultimately, what we're talking about is something called a deep pattern. So remember, I had said when it's not really about what you do, but it's about how you do it. Or better said, it's not about which tool you use to do it, but what it puts together in the end result. Now, I have come to the understanding that all humans have a deep pattern. It's one of those principles that guides how it is that we do things in our life. It's the guiding principle that leads us to our life purpose. No matter how many passions, no matter how many talents, no matter how many skills or ideas, your purpose, your life purpose, and ultimately your soul mission becomes extremely clear once you understand your deep pattern. Because your passions and your talents are actually tools. That's what they are. They're simply tools that you use in this lifetime to carry out your deep pattern. So let's get into the actual concept of a deep pattern. In nature, a deep pattern is something we also call a simple rule or a principle of nature for survival over the long haul. In other words, these are what we have been able to witness and understand from the natural world as these simple ways, because nature is way simpler than we humans are. We are complicated, not even complex. We are complicated. And the thing is that simple rules are actually what allows nature to continuously evolve over the long haul. And although a deep pattern is carried out, it's actually an iterative process. The deep pattern itself, as a rule, rarely changes, but the way that that rule gets carried out is constantly changing based on different challenges and evolutions in order to adapt to constantly changing conditions. So the deep pattern always stays the same in general. It has very, very slight modifications, but it is the application or how you carry out that deep pattern that is constantly changing. And this is why it is so fundamental for multipotentialites to understand their deep patterns. By the end of this episode, I want you to realize that you can have as many passions, as many talents as you want. And although it might feel like you're jumping from one to the other, when you actually know your deep pattern, or as we call it here in Dom and Her, your soul's archetype, when you understand that, you're going to find the thread that connects everything in life. And I've used various different metaphors to get us there. For example, I've used rope as a metaphor, which is really made up of lots of threads. I've used a tapestry where you weave together all these different colors to come up with one image. There's a lot of different visual metaphors for those of us that are visual that help us understand this concept. But let me unpack this a little more so that you can understand how it can apply to your life and really where it is that these concepts even come from. So how you can kind of look into them and understand them better for yourself. I personally had a eureka moment that put all of this stuff together when I was taking a biomimicry for social innovation course a few years back. Now, it's been a while since I've talked about biomimicry, so let's go back to the basics of what is biomimicry. Biomimicry is a design process or a process for producing, designing things, which could be products, they could be services, they could be innovations of any sort. It could be material or structures or even systems that are modeled on biological entities and processes. In other words, biomimicry, you use models from nature, how it is that organisms do things or how organisms grow. For example, if you remember my previous episode where I talked about membranes versus boundaries, that's a great example of biomimicry from a more social innovation or a personal concept, right? The idea that we learn that how nature it is that creates boundaries, and then we apply those principles to ourselves. It really is a large part of the work that I do, taking and adapting and understanding natural models, as well as working closely with those different models. In the case of working with plants, such as like your spirit wild plant. So in biomimicry, you use these models from nature and you adapt them or apply them to human design. Most often, this is actually used to create products. That's the most common and kind of in some ways the easiest way to do it. But for me, I've always loved the social perspective. Even from the first time I ever studied biomimicry, one of the first challenges or problems that I ever worked on with a group, we were solving a social innovation, which was the idea of, in the case of something of a place that has a natural disaster, for example, how do you ensure that girls in particular, who are more likely after an area has had a massive natural disaster, it is girls that more often are pulled out of the education system, young girls, and are kind of put to work at home to clean things up, to fix things, and they tend to not return to school. So where boys might get pulled out, but eventually return back into the school system, especially in certain countries, it's more likely that women or young girls will not. So that was one of the innovations that I worked on. What are the different models that we can look at? And for example, in that particular case, we looked at something like beavers. How is it that beavers teach their young? And we looked at something called stigmergy, which you've heard me talk about in a previous episode, which is a principle in nature of how we continue forward doing things based on the trace that was left behind for us. And I think we used like a wasp or something. Like, I think that was the other organism we looked at. We looked at these different traits and we put them together to create a model, a program that could be very easily put in place in case of a natural disaster that involved principles from all of these. So when you're looking at biomimicry and you're thinking about social innovation, you're really looking at how would nature organize a group of individuals to, for example, create a business or fight hunger or educate young ones, like I was just talking about. So different from physical design, where you can go down to the minute little detail of how the organism actually does a specific thing, like how does an organism move water through, through blood vessels, or liquids, excuse me, not water but liquid through blood vessels, and then you can mimic that when you're creating a pipe of some sort. Or how does an organism create or store energy, which you can use for things like batteries and other aspects. I even saw a really cool design once that was, how do you get kinetic energy from the highway? So these was a team of people who were in California, I think in the Los Angeles area, and they had designed using a combination of like a cockroach's shell and something else. I can't remember the 3 or 4 organisms that were used to create this kind of turbines that, as the cars drive on the highway, through kinetic energy, actually creates energy, because these turbines move. So the idea of biomimicry really is about how do we create using the same principles and building blocks that nature does. But when you're talking about a social innovation, you don't really get into that kind of level of minute, like, I don't know, a beetle uses their shell in this position in order to gather up a little droplet of dew in order to get water in the middle of a desert. That's too detailed for a social innovation. In that case, for social biomimicry, you're really looking for the deep patterns that the organisms use for their organizations. You're looking for a more comprehensive or holistic view. So, a deep pattern in biomimicry refers to a fundamental design principle or strategy that nature has evolved over millions of years to solve specific processes. So, this is more of a principle or a type of strategy that probably goes across multiple organisms rather than how one specific organism does it. So, it's not about the shell of a specific beetle or, beetle shells in general, but it's more at like, okay, any kind of animal will do things in this way, and that becomes your defining principle. By understanding and applying these deep patterns, we can really create systems and products that are more efficient, they're more resilient, and more than anything, they're more in harmony with the natural world. Which is why when you apply these types of deep patterns or common strategies to social innovations, to organizational structures, it feels more natural, because the truth is that it taps in to our kind of deep inherent way of being that we've had conditioned out of us from a human perspective, but that we sort of feel in our bones. So we kind of understand them. And the most common deep patterns used in biomimicry, for example, are called life's principles. And life principles are design lessons from nature. And when you start to hear them, you're all like, oh, that makes perfect sense. Because it's how we function better when we take out the years of conditioning from our educational system, our parents telling us how to do things, and we just sort of sit with it for a while. We get a better understanding that, oh, this feels more true to my natural self. And they're based on the recognition that life on Earth is interconnected and interdependent. In other words, we're all subject to the same operating conditions, and life has evolved, life with a capital L, by the way, life has evolved a set of strategies that have sustained over 3.8 billion years of life, as Biomimicry 3.8 likes to call it out. Now, life's principles represent a kind of overarching pattern. That's the way I think of it, like an umbrella that are found amongst the species that are surviving and thriving on Earth. This is what we see most commonly. And this helps us better understand how and why our planetary forces sort of work, because life integrates and is constantly optimizing these strategies to create the conditions that are conducive to life, as are said in biomimicry. And see, there's things like, for example, be locally attuned and responsive. We as humans try to think on a global scale, but the truth of the matter is that when I'm attuned to my local environment, for example, this morning I was having a conversation with one of my students, who is one of my Damanhurian students in particular, who is Norwegian. And we were discussing how I am currently their instructor, because they're at a part in their kind of initiatic path where they're still sort of at the learning parts, but they're very quickly getting to the place where they're going to be sort of on their own. And one of the things they want to do is create a new, what's called Meted Action, which is our initiatic path group in Norway, where they want to be the instructors. Why? Because they can teach things in a locally attuned and responsive way. In other words, they understand the cultural conditioning that happens in Norway. And so working together with someone like me who knows the Damanhurian path, and then working with them who know the Norwegian path, we can create a much more attuned and effective path that helps people step into that conditioning, liberate themselves from those rivers, and really move towards their path in a faster, quicker way, because it's attuned to their local response. It takes into consideration their culture, their norms, their morality, and all the different aspects that help them in order to be a more in their personal development as well as in their collective development. This is the reason why I have several groups and cultural groups, for example, that I really enjoy working with, because again, it's easier for me to understand their norms, and also why I've moved to many different countries in order to really enter into that fabric and understand it, from, the fact that I'm Cuban American to really to living in Spain, to many of the other types of living and alternative living that I've done, to being in Italy now for so long, to being an esoteric teacher and a Damanhurian. Like, all of this allows me to be attuned and responsive to certain kinds of local conditions. Another principle, another deep pattern that is often used, or a life principle, is to leverage cyclic processes. If you remember, I recently did an episode where I talked very clearly about using natural cycles as well as cultural cycles. What are different cycles like? Spring and summer and all of these different aspects, but also cultural norms like Christmas, or regardless of whether you celebrate Christmas or Samhain or any other principle that affects you. How do you leverage these cyclical processes? And now cyclical processes can even be very kind of tuned to you, in the sense of, for women, their menstrual cycle, although men also have a type of physical cycle. Also the cycle of, the maiden, the woman, and the crone. Like, there are many different cycles. Your menstrual cycle is not the only cycle you have within you. There are multiple cycles, including the moon and all these parts that connect to us. Also, building from the bottom up. We think in a human perspective that we build organizations from the top down, but we know from our empirical data, from all the studies, that building from the bottom up is much more natural. It's how the natural world is built. And that when we build organizations from the bottom up, they actually operate better. Or when we build all kinds of different programs or products, even from the bottom up, there's a stronger support system. So all of these are different types of deep patterns. For example, the Living Building Challenge, which is a green building certification program that uses biomimetic principles to create buildings that function, they really want to apply the idea of a deep pattern of a flower. They look at the flower as their sort of model, and then from there they apply it. There's also organizations that have used these deep principles, these deep patterns and life principles, to create flat organizational structures. There are some organizations such as valve corporation that operate without any kind of manager, allowing employees to choose the projects that they work on and collaborators as needed. They have this really cool handbook that you can find online. And when you're hired, you're not really told what to do. You're asked to self-organize, which is another of life's principles, into work groups to work and create projects that fill the company's objectives. So deciding what to work on is actually probably the hardest part of a job in a place like this. And there's a few different companies out there that are all kind of flat organizations or organizations with no managers. And it's because when you get into this, you realize you are your own manager. And so you're not there to fill a specific job, but more of to ensure that the company as a whole goes in a specific process. And this is closer to the way that we use deep patterns for yourself. So why am I telling you all about deep patterns? And because just as companies have had many different types of people, you also have many different types of personalities, right? You as a whole are made up of lots of individual pieces and definitely lots of personalities. Come on, let's be honest. You all know that you have those moments where you're like, who is that that's speaking? And it's some other part of yourself. And as a multipotentialite, you also have tons of different talents and skills, and you approach each one of these talents and skills in a completely different way. So this is why it might make you seem as if you're like the jack of all trades and the master of none. But I want you to be the jack of all trades and the master of all of them. And here is where knowing your deep pattern can completely change in life. So what is a personal deep pattern, as I call it? Another way of thinking about this, the more kind of dumb and hurrian way of thinking about this, is that your deep pattern is actually your soul's archetype. This is the part that follows you from life to life to life. Now, I'm not going to get into the mechanics of how that looks, although if you ever want to come into one of my classes or come, set up a call with me, we'll talk about your attractor, your personalities, what does that look like? Where does your archetype come from? What are the possibilities and all that deal? What I want to just talk about today is the concept so that you get an idea of why this is so important and why it revolutionizes your entire life. Remember, if you think of yourself that each one of your talents and your skills are all guided by different aspects of your personalities, right? My protector might want to do certain things. My critic might want to do another things. My vulnerable child might want to do something. My playful child might want something else. My ambitious personality needs to do this. Some of us have these personalities extremely pronounced in our lives. We feel all of these different aspects, which is why we get bored if we do the same thing over and over again, because our personalities want to do different things. They want to test. One might really enjoy to use color and maybe be creative, and another one might really like to sit down and work out the logic in a math problem. Another part of your personality might be very athletic, and someone else might just enjoy the psychological games of, really thinking about life through a psychological lens. It could be very many different things. It can also be lots of different other kinds of talents like painting and cooking. And, I had a friend who is an astrophysicist and a nuclear physicist, and yet she's a travel writer, right? So she has these very distinct personalities inside of her. And I think many of us have them. But when you have them and you don't understand your deep pattern, you can feel like you're just jumping from one thing to another. You can put out a list of all of the different ideas. Hold on, for those of you on video, lists like this of all kinds, you can't even see it because of the glare, but lots of lists of different ideas. And then you feel like you're not taking any of those ideas forward because you're actually jumping from one idea to the other and you're really never crossing anything out. I mean, you have to put things in a super minute detail like get up, and then you can cross that off. But if you put it too big, you'll feel like you're never crossing it off. So the reason for this is because at a soul level, you're actually not carrying out those ideas or those different talents. What your soul is carrying out, which is what's necessary for your life purpose, is the deep pattern or the archetype. In other words, what's going to get you to the end of the line, what you incarnated in this life to do, and what's going to make you feel like you're actually moving forward on that path is to understand how you're embodying your deep pattern. Because your deep pattern is what allows you to understand the big picture. Remember, I had said earlier that I use things like the idea of threads of rope that you thread together in order to make nice thick rope. Or a better description is the idea of a tapestry, right? And a rug is made up of lots of little pieces with lots of little colors that come together. And when you take a step back and you see the whole rug, you understand the design. But when you just have all these little pieces of string or all these different colored strings, you can't understand what the design is. But if I have a map, if I have a design in front of me, then even though I'm pulling out different colors, which are your different talents and your different skills, and even your different personalities, you know where to put each one of them. And even though you're constantly switching from one or the other, you know that ultimately the big design is going to unfold. You know that even if you can't see the big design completely, you know you're getting there. And that is what knowing your deep pattern is. And your deep pattern can be many different things. In other words, we at Dumb and Her say that there's at least 163 different deep patterns. These are patterns that exist in the universe, and that a good community, which is why we say that a good sized community is no more than 200 to 220 people, is because that gives us an opportunity to have all of the different archetypes represented with probably a few duplicates because it's nice to have them. For example, I am a bridge. And you've heard me say this before, but now you understand why I'm saying it. I'm a bridge that takes you from where you are to where you want to go. I'm also a really great bridge at helping two people on either side of the bridge understand each other. So I do this via language. I speak multiple languages, and I love not just doing interpretation, because when you interpret, it's so basic. No, that's not true. Interpretation is super freaking hard. But it's why I love working on really complex translations. I'm a part of a team here in Dumb and Her that translates rituals. And I love translating the rituals. I have to do it in a small group of people. And all the different projects have been usually ritual based, because I love that we're connecting from the divine into one language and then moving that into another language and then back to the divine to make sure that it really connects in with the work that that ritual needs to do. And that's my bridge side coming out. I love the fact that I get to be that support system that moves from one level of comprehension to another level of comprehension. Another way that my bridge comes out is as a Kabbalist. I love the tree of life because to me, it allows me to bridge multiple different kinds of religions and schools of thought. It's the other reason why I fell in love with Dom and Her. I felt like Dom and Her gave me the cosmology of the universe, so that no matter whether I'm talking to my mother, who is a Baptist, or I'm having a conversation with my brother, who's a Southern Baptist, which are not the same things, by the way, or one of my students who was originally who was a Buddhist for multiple years, or somebody who's an atheist, it doesn't actually matter. Whatever it is that is your personal belief, the combination of Kabbalah and spiritual physics from Dom and Her allows me to see the unit, what unifies them, and allows me to bridge the conversation so that we can get to the true heart of the conversation without having to confuse the individual choices that you make in order to get to that principle. It's also why I can have conversations with just about anyone of almost any single kind of culture, because again, my deep pattern is that whether I'm using art, because I love art, or music, because I worked in the music industry for so long, or the circus arts like I used to have, or coding when I used to work at Microsoft, it doesn't really matter which one of these tools I call on. I can help bridge from where one person is to where the other one is, or to help people get from where they are to where they need to go, because that's my archetype. And at that point, once I realized it, I understood better why I have so many different passions and why it's okay to jump from one to the other. In this morning, I was using my cultural kind of tools. Right now, I'm using more of my scientific biomimicry tools as I'm talking to you. Later on today, I'm going to use more of my critical tools. I'm going to pull up my my inner critic, to help my students and the positive aspects of an inner critic. I know most of us don't think that an inner critic has a positivity, but trust me, the inner critic does have positive traits. And so I'm going to pull up my inner critic to help somebody bridge from where they are to where they want to go in relation to a report that they're working on. There's many different aspects of how you can do this. And this is one of the things that I work really carefully with my clients on, is to help them, regardless of whatever it is that are their different passions and their ideas, but to get to the soul archetype, to get to that deep pattern that follows their life, in order for them to then apply that and then to feel comfortable pulling from their different tools, because all of my clients are multipotentialites, from pulling from their different tools at different times, even sometimes within the same project, jumping from one thing to the other. So when I look at this big to-do list that I was showing you, and I see all of these different titles, I don't get scared anymore, because I realize that even though some of these have been there for months, like I had one that I just recently scratched off that was a rewrite to something that I needed to do. And I had it there for the longest time. And I would look at it. Now, in my old incarnation, without understanding my deep pattern, I would have thought I wasn't working on it. And when I kept seeing that item on my list for 4, 5, 6 months, I would have thought, my goodness, can I never get anything done? Why is that there for so long? But instead, in this current incarnation, understanding my deep pattern, I realized that that item has to bridge something, right? It has to go from where it was to where it's going. And therefore, there are other tasks or other things I'm either learning or experiencing or getting deeper into myself that needed to come before I could work on that. So in some ways, just reading the task every day meant that some part of me was working on it. So much so that when I did scratch it off, I could then go back and be like, oh, okay, I now realize why this, and this all came before me scratching this off, because all of those were the elements necessary that I needed in order to bridge this piece. It was how my different talents and skills were coming together in order to complete this task. Now, other deep patterns that exist could be the sustainer, right? I am somebody who always sustains things, people, places, projects, and that again can come in many different formats. There's the solar. I'm the one that really injects new energy into something. I create the sort of thinking behind it. I inspire. And it doesn't mean that you might not even have two kind of major patterns. We usually have one primary dominant one and then a minor one. Like for me, I have this visionary part of myself. I can see things multiple years into the future from the perspective of a vision. But it's always a bridge. Like it goes to support my primary deep pattern. And so one of the things that I work on with all of my clients from the very beginning is helping them get much more comfortable with their talents and their skills in order for the deep pattern or the archetype to emerge, in order to understand what it looks like. So it's a really exciting realization about yourself. It's very different from your astrology or your human design or your I Ching or any of these other things, although those can be some of the tools that you use to understand it. But more than anything, it comes to a deeper understanding of why or what are the common characteristics to anything that you might be working on, whether that's painting or whether that is, I don't know, writing a rap song or whether that's fixing a car. Like there are, believe it or not, different patterns or different elements that are the same across all of those different talents that you have. And that is what allows you to uncover your deep pattern. Oftentimes it requires some external help to kind of see what those patterns might be and what are some of the indicators that help you review your different pattern. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of how it is that your own passions and talents can fit into this deep pattern. And again, there are many different types of deep patterns. They don't tend to change, although their application does change. Because remember, one of the overarching life principles is being locally attuned and responsive. So you want to be attuned to the current period of your life. You want to be attuned and responsive to where it is that you're living and how you're living and all of these things. And so this might change the way you apply your deep pattern, but it still doesn't change the deep pattern of yourself, because the deep pattern has been accompanying you all across your different incarnations. It's helping you better understand who you are and how it fits into the purpose of each one of your lives. And because it's your soul archetype, it is a fundamental piece of what your soul, what your full kind of essence is looking to accomplish in this entire cycle that it's living on. So understanding your deep pattern really influences quite heavily, or better said, it helps you understand the choices, and it makes it much easier for you to choose a direction. It helps you, not only, it makes it easier for you to make choices because you're not worried that you're abandoning a project. You're instead focusing on, okay, maybe in this project I've accomplished what I can right now, and now I'm going to go work on this over there, and I know that I'll come back to this if it's part of my pattern. I'll come back to it whenever it's necessary. So it really changes our relationship with our talents and our skills and the things that we do. And therefore, it can be an extremely useful knowledge or a piece of understanding in your daily life. It makes it much easier for you to kind of ease into all of your different talents, for you to see how you're mastering and give yourself the space to master your talents, for you to jump from one talent to another or one skill set to another while still keeping the overall vision in place going forward. And when you have challenges, it helps you see how you can address those challenges more clearly, because those challenges are all about it gives you full access to all of your different tools in your toolbox, which are your passions and your talents and your personalities. It gives you much more space rather than making you feel like you have to focus on only one, or worse, use the famous D word that I despise, which is discipline. I do not like discipline. So these are all the reasons why your deep pattern instead means that you're not just jumping around. You're not pardon me for saying this, but I'll use terms that people might have used. You're not an airhead. You're not somebody who's forgetful. You're not somebody who doesn't have any focus. You're definitely not somebody who has no discipline. None of those things. Instead, you're somebody who is following a deep pattern on the path to a life purpose. And today you're sort of being guided by it rather than guiding it, or rather than managing it yourself. So what we really want to do is help you understand this pattern so that you can then turn around and use this knowledge actively to guide and to consciously choose the different tools you pull from. And this will make the entire process much more fulfilling and exciting. And it'll make you feel like it'll help you understand how you drive this forward, how it is that you actually walk this path from this journey, on this naturally conscious journey with your true nature, with your authentic self. It also makes sure that you don't artificially put yourself into a box because you don't understand how things fit together. So hopefully that's been clear. It's one of those little subtle pieces, and it does take some trial and error to get there. It took me a long time to finally realize I had to go put together different personal mission statements, as well as understanding, kind of looking at all of my quote unquote past lives from this life, as well as from true past lives, to understand, oh, this is how this pattern continues to manifest. I had to listen really carefully to my own words, how it is that I talked about myself across the years, from when I was really young to when I was in different careers. And all of this helped me come to the understanding of what exactly my element is. Plus, there's some magical tools that we can use. People who do specific readings for this, divination that can be used, as well as, again, astrology and human design and all of these different elements. So there's an entire range that we work on. And so to find out what your deep pattern might be, why don't you book a discovery call with me and let's talk about how we can get onto this path. And this is especially if you're one of those multipotentialites that's struggling with thinking that you're not getting things done. Like that's the most, if you're living your life like that, if you're thinking I'm not disciplined enough, if you're getting, if you feel like you're abandoning projects, if you're seeing your list of to-dos completely being left off, like without being able to scratch off anything, please contact me. Let's book a discovery call. I'll put everything into the show notes so that we can talk about how we can work with your deep pattern so that you can get rid of discipline and really become the master of all of your talents, because that's what I want. So if you enjoyed this episode, remember to like, to comment, and to subscribe. And that's, we'll see each other next week, hopefully. And in the meantime, you know where to go. You know where to go for more information, and you know where to find me. All right. Bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of ReConnect with Plant Wisdom. Intro and outro music by Steve Shuley and Poinsettia from The Singing Life of Plants. So join me, Tigrila Gardenia, and my plant collaborators next time on ReConnect with Plant Wisdom. Speak soon.